Hello, everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Prof. Jeffrey Sachs Fan World. And here is today's content. There are moments in a conflict when a single decision, a single weapon, or a single shipment reveals far more than the battlefield itself. Today, as Russia receives a new batch of TOS-1A Solntsepyok thermobaric rocket systems, I believe we are witnessing one of those moments. Not because this weapon is new, it is not. And not because its destructive power will suddenly rewrite the map of Ukraine, but because its arrival exposes something deeper, something more dangerous, a war entering a new phase, shaped not by negotiation or restraint, but by the steady normalization of overwhelming force. For months, the world has watched a conflict defined by attrition, slow grinding, merciless. We have seen cities shattered, economies drained, societies exhausted. Yet even within this grim reality, there remained an unspoken belief that certain lines would not be crossed, that certain weapons would remain symbols of the most extreme moments of war. Thermobarics were one of them. Weapons designed not only to kill, but to terrorize, to collapse. Bunkers ignite oxygen and break the will of defenders through sheer overpressure. So when I see Russia publicly expanding its stock of these systems, I do not see a tactical adjustment. I see a message to Ukraine that the next stage will be harsher than the last, a message to the West that Russia is prepared to escalate regardless of sanctions or condemnation, and a message to its own population that Moscow still holds the initiative, still controls the rhythm of the war. But there is another dimension, one that concerns me even more. The deployment of these weapons tells us that the war is drifting away from any political horizon. It is moving toward a place where destruction becomes routine, escalation becomes expected, and diplomacy becomes an afterthought. Each time thermobarics are fired, each time a fortification collapses under their blast wave, the conflict slides another inch further from the negotiating table and the West. It now faces a dilemma with no easy answer. React too weakly, and Russia feels emboldened. React too forcefully, and the risk of wider confrontation grows. So we are trapped in a dangerous equilibrium, one in which every escalation is matched indirectly rather than resolved, and the war becomes a long industrial struggle rather than a political contest. Tonight, I want to explore what this moment truly means, not just for the battlefield, but for the global order, for the future of diplomacy, for the moral boundaries we claim to uphold. Because the arrival of these systems is not simply a new chapter, it is a warning that the war may be entering its darkest phase yet. When I look at Russia's decision to deploy additional TOS-1A Solntsepyok thermobaric rocket systems, I do not see a simple matter of battlefield reinforcement. I see a deliberate signal, one that reflects the transformation of this war into a campaign defined by overwhelming firepower, psychological pressure, and the steady normalization of extreme weaponry. From my perspective, Moscow is not merely strengthening a front line, it is shaping a narrative. Russia is prepared to escalate further, no matter the cost. The TOS-1A is a unique weapon. I have studied conflicts for decades, and few systems embody such a stark combination of military utility and psychological terror. A thermobaric rocket does not just destroy, it vacuums. Oxygen creates immense overpressure and renders bunkers and shallow trenches meaningless. For soldiers in defensive positions, its presence is a message. Nothing you build is safe. This is why the timing matters. Russia announces these capabilities not quietly but visibly, ensuring both Ukraine and the West understand what lies ahead. It fits a broader pattern I've observed throughout the conflict. Moscow has shifted from maneuver-based operations to firepower-centric warfare, artillery supremacy, glide bombs, long-range missiles, and now an expanded use of thermobarics. The Kremlin seeks to break resistance, not by movement, but by attrition and devastation. Domestically, this escalation also serves a purpose. Russia wants to assure its own public that it still holds the initiative. When wars become prolonged, morale depends on the illusion of momentum. By introducing powerful, brutal systems like the TOS-1A, the Kremlin reinforces the image of a state that continues to escalate while the West debates, delays, and disputes each new aid package to Ukraine. Externally, the signal is even clearer to me. Russia is reminding the West that time is on Moscow's side unless the West chooses to dramatically accelerate its own commitments. Thermobarics symbolize resolve. They convey a message that Russia is willing to absorb sanctions, casualties, and isolation to achieve incremental tactical gains. And in a war of attrition, incremental gains accumulate, but we must also recognize the limitations. As destructive as the TOS-1A is, it does not function as a strategic game changer. Its range is short, its platforms are vulnerable. It requires proximity to the front. Russia will not reshape the entire war with these systems. Instead, it will intensify specific sectors, urban strongpoints, trench networks, and fortified positions where Russia seeks breakthroughs through shock rather than maneuver. What concerns me most is the moral dimension. The normalization of thermobaric weapons, particularly in urban or semi-urban areas, pushes the boundaries of acceptable warfare. The more these systems appear, the more the world becomes numb to their use. And once moral lines erode, escalation becomes easier for all sides. From my vantage point, the TOS-1A is not simply another weapon entering the field. It is a symbol of a war drifting away from political resolution and deeper into a cycle of destruction that neither side can truly win. It tells us that escalation remains, the default diplomacy remains sidelined, and human suffering continues to be the currency of geopolitical ambition. When I consider how the United States and its Western allies will react to Russia's deployment of additional TOS-1A thermobaric systems, I see a familiar pattern emerging, one that I have observed many times in modern conflicts. There will be condemnation, there will be outrage, there will be strong statements about international law and the brutality of Russian tactics. But beyond the rhetoric, the actual response will follow a predictable and restrained trajectory. The West will escalate indirectly. The United States will not answer thermobarics with thermobarics. NATO will not introduce exotic, controversial, or taboo weapons that could blur moral boundaries or trigger unpredictable escalatory spirals. Instead, Washington and European capitals will turn once again to what they know best, incremental increases in military aid framed within the logic of self-defense and deterrence. From my vantage point, the West's military reaction will fall into three main categories. First, there will be a renewed push to supply Ukraine with systems designed to hunt and neutralize Russian heavy launchers. Counter-battery radars, long-range precision artillery, and drone-based targeting networks will be emphasized. TOS-1A units are most vulnerable when moving into firing positions. Western military planners know this very well. The response will be about making the battlefield more dangerous for Russian escalation platforms, not about matching their brutality. Second, I expect a surge in Western support for fortification engineering and survivability. Thermobarics devastate shallow trenches and weak shelters. So the US and EU will likely fund deeper bunkers, reinforced defensive lines, dispersion of troop concentrations, and improve civil defense structures in vulnerable towns. This is not glamorous aid, but it is essential in the face of weapons designed to destroy fixed positions. Third, the West will expand support for air defense and electronic warfare systems, not because these can stop thermobaric rockets directly, but because they can disrupt the reconnaissance cycle that enables Russia to bring such systems into effective range. The modern battlefield is driven by drones and sensors. Disrupting that network weakens thermobaric effectiveness. But beyond the technical domain, there is the political and psychological dimension. Images of TOS-1A strikes, if widely circulated, will harden Western public opinion against Russia. I've seen this dynamic before. Brutality does not always intimidate an adversary's supporters. It often galvanizes them. European governments facing declining enthusiasm for military aid may find their domestic audiences re-energized by the shock of thermobaric warfare. Yet the West's response remains constrained by its overarching strategic goal: avoid direct NATO-Russia military confrontation at all costs. For all the talk of escalation, Western leaders understand the catastrophic implications of an uncontrolled war between nuclear powers. So they will continue walking the narrow path between supporting Ukraine and preserving strategic stability. What concerns me is that this cycle, Russia escalates, the West reinforces, indirectly creates a form of permanent escalation equilibrium. Both sides increase intensity without altering the fundamental trajectory of the war. It becomes a long conflict fought through logistics, production capacity, and political will rather than decisive breakthroughs. From where I stand, the Western reaction to the TOS-1A is predictable: push harder, commit more resources, strengthen Ukraine's defenses, but avoid crossing red lines. It is a response that manages risk but does not end the war. And that is precisely the dilemma facing the transatlantic alliance: how to counter escalation without becoming trapped in an endless cycle of it. When I look at Russia's renewed deployment of TOS-1A thermobaric systems, I cannot view it in isolation. In my experience, studying long and grinding conflicts, such weapons rarely appear without a broader operational purpose. For Ukraine, this development is not simply an increase in destructive power. It is an early signal of what may become a new cycle of concentrated Russian offensives, not necessarily across the entire front, but in specific strategically chosen sectors where Moscow seeks local breakthroughs. The truth is that Ukraine has already faced the TOS-1A before. The system is not new. What is new is the timing, the frequency, and the symbolism of these deliveries. This tells me that Russia is preparing to intensify operations around several contested areas, most likely urban strongpoints, trench complexes, and fortified villages where conventional artillery has struggled to break Ukrainian lines. Thermobarics are rarely used casually. They are a weapon of preparation, a tool to soften defenses, disorient troops, collapse bunkers, and create psychological shock before infantry, armor, or airborne units push forward. When I see Moscow expanding its stock of such a weapon, I infer that Russia is preparing not a massive grand offensive, but a sequence of localized assaults designed to gradually shift the front in its favor. Ukraine knows this. Ukrainian commanders have long understood the dangers of static defensive positions in the face of overpressure weapons. But knowing the threat does not eliminate it. The greatest vulnerability lies in the nature of Ukraine's current battlefield reality: long linear front lines, depleted ammunition, shortages in air defense, limited reserves, and an increasing reliance on Western support that often arrives too slowly. In such conditions, even small Russian advances achieved by overwhelming firepower can create systemic pressure. A village lost here, a trench system overrun there, a ridge captured at high cost over months. These shifts can alter the war's balance. Will Ukraine face a new Russian offensive? From my perspective, the answer is yes, but not in the dramatic, sweeping manner often imagined in Western media. What Ukraine will face instead is a slow, methodical, attritional offensive driven by Russia's growing confidence in its industrial output, ammunition supply, and manpower reserves. The TOS-1A plays a crucial role in this strategy because it is a weapon designed to erase the advantages of a dug-in defender. In urban war, in trench warfare, in forest belts, places where Ukraine has previously held firm through determination and fortification, the thermobaric system undermines the very foundation of static defense. Yet I must emphasize the TOS-1A does not guarantee Russian success. Its short range makes it vulnerable. Its effectiveness requires coordination, and Ukraine has developed impressive countermeasures, drones for detection, Western counter-battery systems, and rapid dispersal tactics. The Ukrainian military, after years of brutal fighting, is far too experienced to be easily shocked. But the psychological dimension cannot be ignored. Thermobarics are terror weapons by design. For soldiers already exhausted and undersupplied, the arrival of these systems communicates a chilling message. The next phase of the war will be even more destructive than the last. From my vantage point, this is the true significance. Not that Russia will suddenly win, but that the war is preparing to enter a harsher, more attritional, and more costly phase for both sides, one in which escalation becomes the norm and diplomacy remains dangerous. When I analyze Russia's renewed deployment of TOS-1A thermobaric systems, I cannot separate the battlefield from the economic engine that sustains it. In my view, the war in Ukraine has evolved far beyond frontline maneuvers. It has become fundamentally an industrial contest, a test of which side can produce, replace, and innovate faster under the pressures of exhaustion, sanctions, and political uncertainty. The reappearance of TOS-1A systems is not only a military decision, it is a reflection of this deeper industrial transformation. What strikes me most is that Russia, despite sanctions and technological isolation, has managed to maintain and even expand production of specialized heavy weapons. This tells me something important. Russia has reorganized its economy into a form of war footing, reallocating resources from civilian sectors into munitions, armored drones, thermobarics, and long-range strike systems. It is not efficient and it is not sustainable long-term, but it is functional enough to sustain a grinding attritional war. In contrast, Ukraine and the West are dealing with a very different set of challenges. Ukraine does not have the industrial base to sustain modern warfare on its own. It depends almost entirely on foreign supply lines, American artillery, European armored vehicles, NATO surveillance networks, and partner-provided air defenses. Ukrainian resilience is built on courage and resolve, but its military sustainability rests on Western logistics. The West, for its part, has the capacity but not the speed. European defense industries were never designed for prolonged high-intensity warfare. They were built for peacekeeping deterrence and small operations. The United States has immense industrial potential, but its political system has become erratic, polarized, and slow to authorize funding. Each aid package becomes a domestic battle. Each weapon shipment depends on political cycles and budgetary brinkmanship. This asymmetry worries me. Russia's political system, centralized, consolidated, authoritarian, enables decisions that the West would debate for months. Moscow can redirect industrial output overnight. The West cannot. And so the war becomes a competition between Russian speed and Western scale. Speed gives Russia short-term advantages. Scale gives the West long-term potential if it can marshal the political will to use it. In this context, the TOS-1A symbolizes more than a weapon. It represents Russia's belief that the war can be won by sustained incremental attrition, supported by an industrial base that continues to deliver destructive tools regardless of sanctions. It is a reminder that technological isolation has not prevented Russia from restoring or improving older weapons, adapting them to modern drone reconnaissance systems and fielding them in numbers that would have seemed impossible 2 years ago. Yet the economics of escalation creates a paradox. The more resources Russia pours into war production, the further it falls behind globally. Its economy becomes militarized but stagnant. Its technological capabilities shift from innovation to replication. Its long-term potential erodes even as its short-term military capacity grows. This asymmetry worries me. Russia's political system, centralized, consolidated, authoritarian, enables decisions that the West would debate for months. Moscow can redirect industrial output overnight. The West cannot. And so the war becomes a competition between Russian speed and Western scale. Speed gives Russia short-term advantages. Scale gives the West long-term potential if it can marshal the political will to use it. From where I stand, the industrial dimension of this conflict is the most underappreciated. Wars are not only decided by bravery or strategy, they are decided by factories, supply chains, labor forces, and political willingness to endure economic costs. Thermobaric weapons remind us that the battlefield is only the surface. Beneath it lies a much larger, more dangerous competition of industry. When I reflect on Russia's renewed use of TOS-1A thermobaric systems, I cannot help but view the conflict through a moral lens as much as a strategic one. I have studied wars for decades, and I have learned that whenever a conflict becomes normalized around weapons designed to inflict overwhelming, indiscriminate destruction, it signals a deep erosion of political imagination. It means that leaders no longer see a future shaped by negotiation or compromise, but only by force, attrition, and exhaustion. Thermobaric weapons, by their very nature, come with moral gravity. They obliterate fortified positions, collapse shelters, and create oxygen vacuum effects that defy the usual boundaries between combatant and non-combatant harm. For me, the increasing reliance on such systems is not simply a tactical decision. It is a reflection of a conflict that has lost sight of the humanity at its center. When sides escalate with weapons that evoke primal fear, the war moves further from diplomacy and closer to a condition where destruction replaces strategy. Yet I must also acknowledge a paradox I have seen repeated in modern conflicts. The more brutal and attritional a war becomes, the more likely it is to generate the long-term political pressure necessary to bring negotiation back into focus. Europe cannot economically sustain an indefinite war. Russia cannot endure perpetual mobilization without cracking its own social fabric. And Ukraine cannot survive an endless war of attrition without the West eventually facing its own political fatigue and shifting priorities. From my vantage point, the greatest risk is not that one side will gain decisive advantage through escalation. It is that both sides will sink deeper into a war of industrial exhaustion fueled by fear, nationalism, and the absence of leadership willing to imagine peace. This war, like many before it, risks becoming self-perpetuating escalation, creates more escalation, retaliation, triggers deeper retaliation, and each new weapon justifies the next. The moral crisis becomes even sharper when we consider the broader global context. The world is approaching an era of geopolitical fragmentation where major powers increasingly see conflict not as failure but as an acceptable means of influence. The use of weapons like the TOS-1A contributes to a dangerous normalization of extreme violence in international politics. If thermobarics become just another expected part of warfare, then we will have crossed a threshold that future generations may struggle to reverse. But I still believe diplomacy is possible. Not because the political conditions are favorable, they are not, but because history shows that even the most entrenched wars eventually reach a point where the cost of continuation exceeds the perceived benefit. The economic burden on Russia is immense. The political burden on Europe is growing. The strategic burden on the United States is unsustainable. And Ukraine, above all, bears the devastation firsthand. For diplomacy to emerge, however, major powers must rediscover the courage to engage in dialogue rather than escalation. That requires Washington and Moscow to view negotiation not as surrender, but as necessity. It requires European leaders to stop treating diplomacy as taboo, and it requires Kyiv to be supported not only militarily, but politically, ensuring its sovereignty and security are not sacrificed in the process. As I see it, the arrival of more TOS-1A systems is not just a military signal, it is a warning that the war is drifting toward deeper normalization of destructive force, and that without a renewed diplomatic vision, Europe risks facing a conflict that could define an entire generation. The challenge of our time is not to defeat the enemy, but to prevent the world from accepting endless war as the new normal.